Hi, everyone. So we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming back. This is our last lecture of our 3-week series on the arts of Jamaica. It's been a great 3 weeks, and I want to thank the cohort of students especially for being, very energetic and for coming to all the seminars and bringing a lot to our conversations. So for tonight's lecture, we are joined by Annie Paul, who is the editor-in-chief of the online magazine of Caribbean writing, PREE, and was the 2023 Lakes Writer-in-Residence at Smith College in Massachusetts. She's on the board of the National Gallery of Jamaica and has published extensively on art. In 2020, she published a biography of Stuart Hall in the University of West Indies Press's Caribbean Biography series. Paul is a founding editor of the journal Small Axe and has been published in international journals and magazines such as Newsweek International, The Guardian UK, Chimurenga, The Caravan India, Slavery and Abolition, Art Journal, South Atlantic Quarterly, Wasafiri, Callaloo, and Bomb, and a range of art books and catalogues such as the Brooklyn Museum's Infinite Island and Documenta 11's Creolite and Creolization. Paul is also the author of the blog Active Voice, which you can follow at anniepaul.net. So we're very grateful to Annie Paul, who led a series of seminars this week, and I'll pass the floor and we'll open at the end for questions. Thank you.
Thanks all of you for coming on an evening after you've been at work, I'm sure, or study. So that's really good of you. My presentation today is about what happens when a nation is primarily a destination, as in, the tourism bogey, which we live with. I mean, Jamaica is glossed as quote-unquote paradise. I suppose Miami is too, in some ways, and you have the tourism as well. Cool, so I'm going to just jump right into it. I had the David Scott quote up earlier just to show you where I got this idea of the contemporary as opposed to contemporary, because I'm talking about vision. I'm not talking about contemporary art, but many different kinds of art that coexist, that are contemporary, because they occupy the present, but that doesn't make all of them contemporary art, if you know what I mean. Okay, so in early 2017, art worlds in the US and elsewhere were transfixed by the bronze statue of a small girl, frontally positioned with arms akimbo and face tilted upwards in defiance, that was strategically placed in front of the famous sculpture of a raging bull that had decorated Wall Street for some decades. Arturo Di Modica had installed his charging bull sculpture in the financial district in the late 1980s, putting the large statue in place overnight without a permit. The interventionist sculpture Fearless Girl by Kristen Visbal was installed in 2017 and strategically positioned as if the little girl was facing down the rampaging bull. The motive of this intervention was to draw attention to the need for more female representation on Wall Street boards. But the sculptor of Charging Bull was affronted by the addition of the new statue, saying it changed the meaning of his original, making the bull not a symbol of strength, but an ominous villain. He also called the statue an advertising trick. So all of this, while this thing was raging, my mind was kind of clicking along, and I started to wonder, about how we could apply a similar juxtaposition or confrontation between two works in the Jamaican context. So this battle over representational space on Wall Street continued for months on social media platforms and elsewhere. Inspired by the putative recontextualization of Wall Street's raging bull, with the addition of Fearless Girl to its auratic space, this presentation explores the generative possibilities of inserting a Ready Freddy carving into the representational space occupied by the, by the Jamaican nation's #1 icon, Negro Aroused. Carved by the country's premier sculptor Edna Manley just before 1938, during a decisively formative conjuncture in Jamaican and Caribbean history, when harsh economic conditions and prospects had triggered violent riots around the region, Negro Aroused has the status of sacred sculpture in Jamaica. That's Ready Freddy, okay? And so I found myself wondering what it would be like if we had a clash between these two works, right? One whose title is Negro Aroused, this sacred cow of Jamaican art, and then this other one who's known as Ready Freddy, but is literally a quote-unquote Negro Aroused, or Rasta Aroused, to be more specific. So Ready Freddies, on the other hand, are large priapic wooden carvings sold in the environs of the North Coast, in Fern Gully, just outside Ocho Rios, for example, to the tourist trade. What might the juxtaposition of these two artworks tell us about the construction of nationhood in Jamaica? One draws on the dubious trope of the noble savage, which is Negro Aroused. The trope of the noble savage to signal the rise of a new, proud black nation, while the other is a monument to the sex tourism that is today the staple on which this quote-unquote desti-NATION is founded. The two sculptures or carvings represent a clash of the sacred and the profane in Jamaican society, between them mapping the highest and lowest points of national representation in visual art, with another national monument, Laura Facey's Redemption Song, depicting a distinctly unaroused, let me see if I have it next. No, I don't, not yet. Yeah, you'll soon see that one. Depicting a distinctly unaroused nude black couple plumbing a convenient midpoint. Examining the symbolic and rhetorical discourse in which these artworks are embedded provides a way to read the current conjuncture countries such as Jamaica find themselves in today. What is the implicit rhetoric of carvings such as Negro Aroused and Ready Freddy? What might the presence of such figures tell us about sex and the citizen in Jamaica and the region? What is their relationship to the nation and its citizens? Citizenship in the Caribbean, as we are reminded by M. Jackie Alexander, continues to be premised within heterosexuality and principally within heteromasculinity. Negro Aroused. According to the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, Edna Manley, the wife of Jamaica's premier Norman Manley, first created Negro Aroused in 1935 and exhibited it in 1937. We are told that, quote, from its exposure, Negro Aroused excited the public's imagination, was acquired by public subscription and presented to the Institute of Jamaica, end quote. The reference to the acquisition of Negro Aroused by quote-unquote public subscription and the faint suggestion that it was the working public who subscribed to its purchase warrants challenging, as even today, there is little interest in high art on the part of the average worker or labor union member. And it would be truly remarkable if vast numbers of such workers were moved to contribute to some mid-century version of a GoFundMe campaign on behalf of such a stylized and elite representation of the laboring male. What is important is that this was the historical narrative that helped canonize Negro Aroused as the most important artwork or icon in the nation's hegemonic repertoire of images. So what is the rhetoric of Negro Aroused? The claims made on behalf of the sculptor Edna Manley were fulsome, according her the title of Mother of Jamaican Art, among other things. Director / chief curator of the National Gallery of Jamaica, David Boxer, claimed that Manley had, quote, forged a personal iconography rooted in the careful observation of the physiognomies, the physiques, the stances, and the gestures of working-class Jamaicans, end of quote. Her wooden sculptures were said by her close friend, anthropologist M.G. Smith, to have caught the inner spirit of our people and flung their rapidly rising resentment of the stagnant colonial order in a vivid, appropriate sculptural form, end of quote. According to Boxer, Edna Manley's works have truly become the icons of that period of our history, a period when the Black Jamaican was indeed aroused, ready for a new social order demanding his place in the sun. Thus was Negro aroused inscribed into a local iconography of nationalism. A young poet and protege of Edna Manley, George Campbell, was even moved to write a poem titled Negro Aroused. The melodramatic, hortatory tone of the poem betrays the civilizing mission of Drumblare, the name of the Manley House after which the artistic and literary movement fostered by the Manleys was named. So, in contrast, what is the plain speak of Ready Freddy? Fast forward, this is also, so there are many copies or versions of Negro Aroused. This one is on the waterfront, just around the corner from the National Gallery of Jamaica. Right. So fast forward to the last decade of the century and another carving, one without the impeccable nationalist pedigree of Negro Aroused, but which is the embodiment of its title, started to rear its ugly head in Fern Gully, the leafy green corridor leading to Ocho Rios, one of Jamaica's tourist capitals. Generically named Ready Freddy, the carving depicts a standing Rasta man, naked, with an engorged, outsized penis protruding from his body. Smaller versions are sold as souvenirs, while the giant one serves as an attraction for tourists who like having their pictures taken alongside it. Who and what does Ready Freddy represent? In her 2004 book, Sexing the Caribbean, Kamla Kempedu discusses markers of hegemonic Caribbean masculinity, quote, continually evoked and paraded in the tourism industry, end of quote, referencing, quote, an insatiable sexual desire and a large, ever-hard penis, end of quote. According to her, quote, this image is reproduced endlessly in Negril, Jamaica, through carvings, drawings, and artifacts produced for tourist consumption that depict men with large, erect penises, the big bamboo. The big bamboo is also celebrated in song and is a prominent feature of the soundtrack on rotation at Jamaican hotels. Maureen Sheridan, in her book examining Bob Marley songs, notes that, quote, the big bamboo, a longtime humorous favorite of first-time tourists at North Coast hotels, sums up the sexual ideal of permanent, if flexible, erection. For the big bamboo to be celebrated in song is one thing. For it to be given material form in so blatant a manner was apparently another matter. The rampant Ready Freddies or aroused Rastamen would not have attracted national attention had they remained on the beach or in tourist enclaves. But appearing in vendor stalls in Fern Gully, the main access road to the tourist town of Ocho Rios, the carvings aroused enough national embarrassment and discomfort to cause Portia Simpson Miller in 2002, during her tenure as tourism minister, to order them removed for being in breach of the country's obscenity laws. The following letter to the editor exemplifies a typical complaint. The editor, sir, Ray Obscene Publications, Obscene Objects, Large erect penises in Fern Gully. I am an attorney at law, and I believe a decent citizen of Jamaica with a fair degree of moral standing. I drive through Fern Gully with my 2-year-old and 10-month-old daughter, as there are several. I wince every time I drive through with my 2 daughters, as there are several Rastafarian sculptures with large erect penises enlarged for a more egregious effect. And he goes on, providing legal reasons why, quoting subsection 3, section A, etc., and says that he ends by saying, the decline in our moral standing as a nation is traceable to glaring lawlessness. These obscene objects are just one of many examples of depravity throughout the island. The decent Jamaicans still left in this island must stand together, Jamaicans still left, must stand together and act or fall together, leaving our children's future at serious risk of blight. Likewise, an editorial in the hospitality supplement of the Gleaner deemed the carvings pornographic and bemoaned the lack of creativity of the artists. Whatever is in the minds, quote, whatever is in the minds of the merchants who peddle this type of ware, in my mind it is pornography being forced on the public, our innocent children, and the people who take this route. Our Jamaican men and their supposed big bamboos are already an attraction. We don't need wood carvings on the streets. End of quote. But such strident objections were by no means unanimous. In response to Gammon, another letter writer argued for a less blinkered view of the carvings. Mr. Gammon and his supporters have failed to appreciate the fact that concepts of morality and obscenity tend to be personal or cultural, and as such, what one person or a particular culture finds immoral or obscene may very well be enlightening or quite acceptable by another. For art to survive, it must be left open to varying degrees of interpretation and styles. An erect penis in Fern Gully is not offensive, nor does it contribute to moral decay in our society. So, there was a lot of back and forth, but the moral majority certainly dominates the media, debates in the media. Okay, so the next section is called, this is the Emancipation Monument. Art for tourists versus art for the nation. How did the attempts and calls to censor the Fern Gully carvings play out? One craftsman, Rennie Trail, the carver of the 10-foot-tall Ready Freddy, whom you just saw, was actually taken to court over it. In a Gleaner article titled "Standing Firm Despite Criticism," he detailed his encounter with the law and his motivation for creating the large carving. According to Trail, it was a giant carving which he valued at roughly US $1,000, that was stimulating business in the key corridor to the North Coast, where craft vendors were experiencing a downturn in sales. Quote, "With recession now, if it wasn't for this guy, we wouldn't make $1, said Trail. The market's so slow now, but when tourists pass and see this guy, they stop and take a picture and spend the money. This guy do a lot of good for everyone here," Trail said, adding, quote, "Me know it would be a good attraction, and it worked out very well for me. This guy sent me 3 children to school, so it really worked out good for me. People just stop, take picture, and spend the money." End of quote. Trail told the Gleaner he was taken to court because law enforcement personnel considered his work offensive. But fortunately for him, the judge disagreed. Quote, "When me go, the judge say nothing wrong with it, because there is one at Emancipation Park. So if they move this one, they have to move the one at Emancipation Park, which is this one, which construed as high art, which is construed as high art. So there's no, people did object to the nudity of it, but the art license won out, right? So, but the judge used that to actually defend this man's right to have a carving like Ready Freddy in Fern Gully. So, the Emancipation Park sculpture mentioned by the judge was Redemption Song, a gigantic bronze monument sculpted by Laura Facey Cooper, one of Jamaica's most accomplished sculptors, in 2003, depicting 2 nude, newly emancipated slaves whose upturned heads clearly referenced Negro aroused and whose docile, naked bodies suggested blank texts waiting to be inscribed. Commissioned by the government to commemorate the emancipation of the enslaved, the unveiling of the monument was followed by a furore, with many Jamaicans declaring it obscene and demanding its removal. One frequently voiced objection by Jamaican men was that the male figure, though splendidly endowed, conspicuously lacked an erection, despite facing a voluptuous naked female figure. What kind of man was this, they asked, casting aspersions on his sexuality. The subtext was that no Jamaican man worth his salt would have remained unaroused when faced with a naked woman. The emancipated penis must stand erect and proud, just as citizens are expected to stand at attention when the national anthem is played. Soon after the Emancipation Monument was installed, an interesting episode occurred. A woman walked up to it, stripped down to her panties, and climbed in with the emancipated couple. Described as being of quote-unquote unsound mind, the woman simply stood in the pool along with the gigantic figures, attracting a number of bystanders until she was eventually removed by the police. The implication seemed to be that while artistic representations of nude bodies might have symbolic value, in real life, nudity was less than desirable, leaving little or no room in public spaces for nude bodies to exist. The living body is a perennial problem, especially the biopolitics of excluded or marginalized bodies, such as the woman of quote-unquote unsound mind. Susan Maines captures the complexity of what may be termed body language well. Quote, metaphorically and physically, the body is one of the most immediate and poignant testimonies to lived experience, and as such, it is one of the most complex and contested political texts. Human bodies, both identifiable as specific individuals and in a more abstract form, have figured as prominent features in numerous public monuments. As such, visible components, these bodies have frequently been catalysts for moral quandaries about the desirability and appropriateness of human forms, end quote. Riffing on the subject of the emancipated couple in 2016, artist Camille Cheddar produced a version of the monument titled Too Close for Comfort, depicting a nude male couple. Painted with acrylic on plastic, the artwork was clearly a reference to the politics of sexual citizenship in Jamaica. While the material used, plastic, gestured towards the politics of disposability and the disposable people on the margins of Jamaican society, its perishables. A work by another artist, Laisho Johnson, could also be seen as quoting Negro Aroused, although it does so by portraying its antithesis or obverse, a black caricature with head turned down in anguish, grimacing with pain while being pierced by dozens of arrows. A veritable anti-Negro Aroused, Johnson's artwork references Christian saint and martyr Saint Sebastian, who has also become a gay icon. Johnson produced the work in desolation at the murder of gay clothing designer and LGBTQ icon Dexter Pottinger in Kingston in 2018. Despite having stabbed Pottinger repeatedly, his murderer, Romario Brown, was sentenced to only 12 years on a reduced charge of manslaughter after pleading what the Gay Star News called a quote-unquote gay panic defense. That is, claiming he acted in self-defense because Pottinger allegedly came to him quote-unquote naked and aroused. As the Jamaica Observer newspaper in Jamaica put it, quote, the court heard that Brown stabbed the designer after he went to his home and while outside on the balcony cutting up marijuana, saw Pottinger appear naked with his penis erect, end of quote. The leniency shown in the sentencing of Brown clearly reflects the nation's view of what it considers appropriate sexuality and illustrates a point made by M. Jacqueline Alexander in her groundbreaking 1994 essay about the ways in which naturalized heterosexuality shaped the definitions of respectability, Black masculinity, and nationalism in the Caribbean. quote, the state moves to police the sexual and reinscribe inherited and more recently constructed meanings of masculinity and femininity, while simultaneously mediating a political economy of desire in tourism that relies upon the sexualization and commodification of women's bodies. Further, the nationalist state mediates the massive entry of transnational capital within national borders, but blames sexual decadence, lesbian and gay sex and prostitution for the dissolution of the nation, end of quote. An anecdote from a recently published memoir, Bornia, The Life and Times of a Jamaican Painter, presents a curious counterpoint. The author, Judy Ann Macmillan, recounts an occupational hazard she often faced in her studio practice. A recurrent problem with male models was that they would inevitably be aroused when asked to strip naked and pose for Macmillan, who unperturbed would paint away, occasionally editing out the huge erections she encountered. The story of one of them, Bap, the goat herder, who, when invited to model for her, told Judy Ann he had once posed for Edna Manley, prompts a mischievous dig at the latter. Quote, in truth, he looked exactly like that statue of Bogle that she did, a short, tough little man, and now I know where she got the idea for the huge machete that he holds down the front of his body, end of quote. Whether Macmillan would have been granted any leniency had she murdered one of these male models on the grounds of feeling threatened by their erect penises is moot, as male sexuality is normative and nationally approved, and an erect penis in response to a female body is to be commended rather than punished. One might also consider the questions raised by Cheddar and Johnson's works. Are only certain erections nationally endorsable? Can only certain quote-unquote Negroes become aroused and still be considered Jamaican? Like all Caribbean countries and many others around the world, heteronormativity is a prerequisite for citizenship in Jamaica. But where does this leave the quote-unquote queer citizen whose sexual orientation renders him outside the scope of the quote-unquote moral state? All the artworks mentioned previously are examples of so-called mainstream art as opposed to subgenres such as intuitive art or tourist art. In her doctoral thesis, where considerable space and attention is devoted to an analysis of tourist art, Verle Poupé, the Belgian-born art historian and curator, notes the distaste and disapproval with which arts such as the Ready Freddy carvings are viewed by the official art establishment in Jamaica, a potential double standard considering that, quote, explicitly erotic art is regularly shown at the National Gallery of Jamaica, where it is sheltered from accusations of obscenity by its high art status. Right, so this is a quote from her. The moralistic condemnation of these carvings, however, obscures other aspects of their significance as culturally expressive objects. The carvings can also be read as a carnivalesque gesture in service of the politics of informal vending. The quote-unquote big bamboo man, for all his shortcomings, forcefully claims space and visibility in a tourism industry that has marginalized his producers and vendors, and it is probably no coincidence that he has appeared primarily in the contested space of Fern Gully. So, for example, this carving by Woody, a sculptor named Woody, or a carver named Woody, is considered, well, he was considered an intuitive artist, and so his art work is automatically high, and although you can see that the subject has an enormous erection, it's very abstract, and so that is permissible, you know? Woody's carving is more attuned to the noble zeitgeist of Negro aroused, inoffensively nude compared to the nakedly rude Fern Gully carvings, making it a signifier of high art and good aesthetic taste, rather than popular or low tourist art. Whereas Woody's Priapus aims at a universalism with currency in the international marketplace, Ready Freddy is a signifying object couched in the vernacular of tourism, a globalized transnational tongue intelligible to tourists, vendors, and sex traders alike. Ultimately, the argument is not about the aesthetic virtue of one object over the other, but about their legitimacy as signifying objects servicing particular constituencies and projects. As Poupe points out, quote, most tourist carvings are therefore quite simply what they are, new transcultural commodities that emerge from the dialogue between the culture and economic needs of the popular masses and the expectations of the tourist market. With their in-your-face, crudely rendered sexual organs, Ready Freddies could also be seen as a species of male fertility symbols, falling plumb into the ancient archive of priapic images and representations found in most cultures. The Egyptians, for instance, had an ancient god named Min, an ithyphallic deity of fertility, always represented with an erect penis, much like Ready Freddy. And, you know, they sell mass-produced copies in the tourist market in places like Cairo and elsewhere. Yet, as visual signs or signifying objects, Ready Freddies have a lot in common with other art objects, although their purpose is not necessarily to elevate or edify, but to reference or advertise the informal sex/romance tourism industry in Jamaica, indexing the male body as a post-colonial contact zone. It seems appropriate at this point to take a detour and scan the terrain of transactional sex elsewhere in the region. As noted earlier, the Caribbean state is happy to accommodate a political economy of desire that relies upon the sexualization and commodification of women's bodies. Ready Freddy reminds us that such sexualization and commodification is not restricted to female bodies, allowing us to examine in some depth the variant of sex or romance tourism indexed by his upright member. Whereas in patriarchal societies, female bodies are more commonly the target of transactional sex, in the Caribbean, a sub-industry of male prostitution has developed, with young men servicing mainly European and American women, although there is resistance to the word prostitution, with euphemistic terms such as escort or companion being preferred. Films such as Heading South and When Stella Got Her Groove Back, the film based on Terry McMillan's novel of the same name, highlighted the availability of young men and the female tourists who travel to countries such as Haiti and Jamaica to avail themselves of the services on offer. In Havana, Cuba, there's a similar coyness about calling a spade a spade. Male prostitutes there usually service men, but they too demur at calling it prostitution. It's a job like any other, says Dania, a young man who tries to explain the difference between a male prostitute and him, who also does not accept being called a pinguero, which is what the young men of the sex trade are called in Cuba. In Cuba, as in Jamaica, prostitution is against the law. The deterioration of both economies in the last few decades has pushed citizens to offset the precarity of their circumstances by monetizing their bodies. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed in the wake of the demolition of the Berlin Wall, and with neoliberalism on the rise, Cuba was forced into a special period of intense hardship with preferential trade and aid from the now-defunct Soviet Union suddenly evaporating. According to Kempadu, the tendency to gloss sex tourism as romance tourism rather than prostitution is also prevalent among heterosexual female sex workers and their clients. For both male and female sex workers, hustling is a better way of providing for themselves and their families, constituting an escape from low-paying or demeaning work and exploiting an avenue to becoming, quote, a full participant in the transnational globalized world, end of quote. Pruitt and Lafont, who researched the burgeoning sex tourism industry in 1990s Jamaica, also emphasize the emotional intimacy involved and the discourse of romance such transactional relationships are embedded in. Quote, "The purpose here is not to debate whether these men are prostitutes, but rather to convey the distinctive meaning these relationships hold for the partners and to acknowledge their definition of the situation. Significant here is the fact that neither actor considers their interaction to be prostitution, even while others may label it so. The actors place an emphasis on courtship rather than the exchange of sex for money. These liaisons are constructed through a discourse of romance and long-term relationship, an emotional involvement usually not present in sex tourism. While both parties may share the ideal of a sustained relationship, the meanings such a relationship holds are different for each of them. However, the framework of romance serves both of them as they seek to maximize the benefits they derive from the tourism relationship." End of quote. In Jamaica, the reluctance to call sex work what it is might also have something to do with its criminalization and the policing and penalization of sex workers under anti-harassment programs introduced in tourist areas in the late 90s. As researcher Beverly Mullings has pointed out, under the Towns and Communities Act and the Tourist Board Act, people could be arrested for quote-unquote antisocial behavior, under the umbrella of which came, quote, soliciting for the purpose of prostitution. It seems then that there are very rational reasons for resorting to the language of love and romance instead of the more direct sex work or prostitution. Returning to our signifying object, Ready Freddy, it begs noting that the carving's invocation of a Rastafarian body represents a contradiction in terms. True followers of Rastafari, a back to Africa, nature, decolonial movement, and invented tradition with strict views on self-sufficiency, healthy diet, and lifestyle would hardly be commingling with white tourists and servicing their sexual needs. So how and when did the Rastafarian body hairstyle get imbricated in sex tourism? According to Kempadu, the term rent-a-dread was coined in the 1990s due to the high number of dreadlocked beach boy hustlers and the global popularity of Bob Marley, whose flashing locks signified the epitome of Jamaicanness. Nothing could be further from an orthodox Rastafari than a rent-a-dread, but the locked hairstyle of the former has now become emblematic of the latter, synonymous with notions of quote-unquote authentic Jamaicanness. A serious irony considering that in the 1960s, the government tried its best to ethnically cleanse Jamaican society of Rastafari citizens whom they considered to be decidedly unsuitable subjects and a threat to the nation. A true Rasta would be ideologically opposed to almost everything a rent-a-dread signifies, yet his image is pressed into use in the basest of ways by citizens living on the brink of the national project, literally working its beachy fringes and leveraging location and culture to their advantage. Can anything be sacred in the margins of society? The modus operandi of the hustlers includes open flattery, constant references to their stamina, and the pleasure and guaranteed satisfaction they can give a woman. The following excerpts from a Dutch journalist's account of her time in Negril captures the shockingly direct manner in which approaches are made to white female tourists, seemingly by all and sundry, including the hotel or guest house guard. "Just cop a feel," Omar glances downward and states with a big smile, "This is what the women come for, the big bamboo." "Are you really for rent?" asks the Dutch journalist. Omar grins. "Sure, and how? I work 5-6 hours in a row," he says, and it takes a while for me to get what he means. The word work, has several meanings. "I work myself in a sweat, go on until we are wetter than the sea. Really, I go all the way. When I make love, it's like a battlefield. I'm Bin Laden in bed." And then finally, his ultimate blandishment is, I bow, meaning oral sex is on the menu, despite voluble, declarations to the contrary by Jamaican men. That night, so that night, the journalist says there's a pounding on her door. The night guard wants to know if it's true that I expect a visitor because there's a boy at the entrance. She mumbles that he should just send him away. The night watchman nods approvingly, but before I close the door, he subtly offers his services. So, end of quote. Next section, the romance of sovereignty. The quote-unquote romance of sovereignty. Sovereignty and autonomy remain overriding concerns, both for those privileged with full citizenship in Jamaica as well as the Jamaican state itself. It is less of a concern for those at the bottom of society who already live with drastically reduced autonomy and sovereignty. If Negro Aroused was an aspirational representation, a signifier of decolonization and an attempt at reconstruction of a sovereign self in the decades leading up to independence, Ready Freddy crafted for the quote-unquote tourist gaze a veritable embodiment of the hollowed-out citizenship experienced by the lowest rungs of society is a rude reminder of the failures of post-coloniality and the compromised nature of the quote-unquote sovereignty enjoyed by the state and its citizens. Curiously, the concept of romance tourism discussed above and attributable to Pruitt and Lafont arose out of research into sex tourism they had conducted in Jamaica. They felt the tendency of rent-a-dreads and their clients to forge longer relationships with each other, sometimes lasting for years, often with emotional involvement signaled desires and needs that went too far beyond the merely sexual transaction at the base of it, to be reductively described as sex tourism. In his influential essay, Necropolitics, Achille Mbembe discussed, quote-unquote, the romance of sovereignty, which rests on the belief that the subject is the master and the controlling author of his or her own meaning, end of quote. This raises the question, is the romance version of sex tourism only possible in places where sovereignty itself remains a romantic notion? Places such as the Caribbean, which has indentured its most vulnerable citizens to this most basic of industries, the quote-unquote oldest profession in the world. So I'm getting to the end, be patient. This one of these, the final sections is called Chinese Government and Other Immoral Erections in the Debased Present. Even as Ready Freddy inexorably indexes Jamaica's debased present, he is also a paradigmatic emblem of globalization from below, as articulated by Stuart Hall and others. Arguably, Ready Freddy is a classic example of what Hall called the consequences of the margins coming into representation. Not just, quote, not just to be placed by the regime of some other or imperializing eye, but to reclaim some form of representation for themselves, end of quote. The intimate relationships between older women, often white, from overdeveloped countries, and young black men from underdeveloped nations overturn traditional expectations of sex, that it is for procreation rather than pleasure, hence the condemnation of homosexuality as an abomination, that it is primarily for the pleasure of men rather than women, and that it is almost universally an enactment of male power. Each barters something of value to the other and gains satisfaction most of the time. As such, countries such as Jamaica are at the frontier of experimentation in gender relations. Although Ready Freddy is by no means representative of the, quote, respectable masculinity that the state demands, neither does he represent a servile masculinity. Rather, he signals a pragmatic acceptance of the realpolitik of the state of affairs in 21st century Jamaica. In her exegesis of sex tourism in the Caribbean, Kempado quotes a Rasta who verbalizes the transaction succinctly. Quote, "There is no free love for the underprivileged. We will grant their wishes for free, but with an expectation of promises, which is usually that the future will be better," end of quote. That such citizens cannot rely on the state to ensure a better future and have to resort to tourists and random visitors to the island is a bitter comment on the precarity and chronic state of contingency, verging on emergency, that they live with. A number of commentators have noted the steady decline in the standard of living of Jamaicans, while others make sarcastic jokes about the huge buildings being erected all over the corporate area, funded and in collaboration with the Chinese. Great disquiet about China's increasing investment in Jamaica and a fear that the country will soon lose all autonomy. Commenting on the multi-storied edifice being built to house the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on the site of the former Myrtle Bank Hotel, popular columnist Gordon Robinson lamented the erasure of history this entailed. So this former historical site is being swept away on the winds of expedience, whose policy seems to be encouraging erection as a tool for government enlargement. And ironically, this new and bigger government erection is said to be a gift from the Chinese. Still, our foreign affairs seem to be conducted for the sole pleasure of Big Bully from the north, no matter how sadistically that partner's flailing about, wham bam, thank you ma'am style has turned out to affect us. So China gives us an erection to help us to better enjoy foreign affairs with BBN. Brilliant. Quote, "But it also appears that government's engorgement isn't confined to the public conduct of foreign affairs on Port Royal Street. The latest plan for government to pleasure itself has been unveiled as involving the capture of National Heroes Park for a massive new collective erection for MPs. It also involves the demolition of surrounding areas, including Almond Town, to accommodate a government zone which involves new erections for several existing ministries," end of quote. The steady decline in the living standards of Jamaicans was mapped in another column, taking stock of the country just after the 57th anniversary of independence on August 6, 2019. Acidly pointing out, quote, "Full employment occurred in slavery. It did not mean that Jamaicans were well off," end of quote. The authors of the column debunked the ruling government's boast that in 2018 unemployment had fallen to 9.1%, the lowest in 50 years. According to them, over the 10-year period from 2007 to 2017, the proportion of persons living below the poverty line increased from 9.9% to 19.3%, or more than 500,000 people. This dismal scenario is true of much of the rest of the Caribbean as well. Of note is the fact that, judging by the dire economic conditions forcing marginalized citizens in both Jamaica and Cuba to turn to their last resource, their bodies, in order to keep afloat, it would seem that free market capitalism has not delivered the goods it promised. Worse, a neo-colonial mentality remains firmly in place in countries such as Jamaica, where poll after poll has found a majority of citizens saying that the country should have remained a colony of Britain. Tweeting the day before the 57th anniversary of Jamaican independence, Don Robotham, formerly of the Workers' Party of Jamaica, which is the Communist Party, now a professor at the City University of New York, spotlighted the colonial mentality that still prevails. Quote, "What does it say about Jamaica that the main road into the business district of the capital is named Trafalgar and the connecting one Waterloo? Meanwhile, reggae, rasta, and dancehall bubble up from below." Almost 20 years into the 21st century, Jamaica is still suffering from a profound identity crisis arising from the refusal to come to terms with the Afro-Creole culture Moore and Johnson identified as its hegemonic culture. Negro aroused was emblematic of the Creole nationalism that founded the nation on various untruths. that it was an English-speaking country, that it was a racial democracy, and that civility and respectability politics would redeem everyone. Until the Jamaican nation, its managers and stakeholders are willing to come to terms with what exactly Ready Freddy represents and do something to change the circumstances which brought him into being, we are unlikely to move on from being a destination to becoming a polity that treats all its citizens with respect, providing them with the resources and support needed to become self-determining, sovereign subjects in the true sense of the word. Yeah, I think I'll just close there.
Thank you for that. It was very stimulating conversation. However, I was kind of, my thinking was, when I first heard about this, that you were going to be talking about contemporary art in Jamaica. I was kind of curious about what was going on.
Well, that's why I didn't call it contemporary.
Well, no,
I
we
used
got
the
we
word
got it.
contemporary.
Yes, we got that.
That was very deliberate. Yeah. But in the 3 seminars that we've just concluded over the last 3 days, I did present a lot of contemporary art.
Okay,
So sorry you missed that. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Okay, so that's why I was kind of curious if you want to maybe address a little bit in summary what you did. That might not be so fair, but I'm wondering if the Caribbean is really producing a change, contemporary art, the language is changing. Is the community still very interested in the arts? Because I know for sure that my parents, my grandparents, back in the 30s were collectors and were interested in art and culture, right? And for me, that's really a core part of Caribbean culture, is the interest in, I don't know if it's necessarily associated with class, but there's a strong interest in art and culture, even from the ground up. It might not be rooted in European ideas of what's good art, but there's an interest in that, and it's connected to the majority of the descendants come from Africa.
Right.
And art and culture has always been a very big part of the way we live. So I wonder if you could just, again, summarize what you think, because, say, in the United States, you have some Jamaican artists that are making headways in the high-end market. Someone like Nari Ward or Ebony Patterson, for example. You know, they're creating a language that's really based on their Jamaican experience, which shows that there's a lot of sophisticated cultural roots in Jamaica. So if you could just address that quickly, maybe.
Well, remember that Nari, Ward, and Ebony don't live in Jamaica, right? So they live in the diaspora. And there's quite a difference between art produced in the diaspora and art produced back home. This is one of the things that we focused on a lot in the last 3 days. You know, in Jamaica, there's a kind of devotion to representations of the body. Not only that, but also very hyper-real representations, right? And so it's not responding to any kind of demand from outside, because outside and within the international networks and the global networks of art are less interested in that kind of very naturalistic representation. And they are more interested in art like Ebony's and Nari's, which deals with themes of globalization, sexuality, and many other global themes which are circulating and are part of a global conversations. Unfortunately, Jamaican artists, many of them, the ones based in Jamaica, are not participating in those conversations for whatever reason. And I find that this is one reason their work does not make it beyond. They have to literally leave and go abroad and live and work abroad to get the kind of opportunities that you see some of the people in the diaspora getting. But at home, it's all about, I don't know, about, they're not making art that is necessarily going to be of great interest to anyone outside Jamaica, right? And many, many, many reasons for this. And also about that generational shift that you hinted at, there has been a generational shift. We also talked about the fact that art patronage is declining drastically with the younger professionals and so on. They don't see the need to collect art. They don't seem to consider it an activity worth pursuing. And this could be because they haven't been educated in the ways and rituals of collecting, or it could be that it's a different generation. I'd like to know, I mean, whether globally there is a kind of sloping downwards when it comes, because also think about the fact that this visual art, and I'm making a distinction, I mean, I'm talking about the Eurocentric visual art that we are talking about, right? I'm not talking about the Afro-Caribbean, many, many expressions of art and culture. That's a separate thing, but the studio art, gallery art, exhibition, art for exhibitions, is a very European tradition, and it hasn't been transformed in the way it's practiced in Jamaica. It's still, people are still kind of reproducing the same categories of European art history and other, other kinds of tropes of what constitutes good art or the different movements. Many of them think that simply, okay, so you have art povera, so we must have certain artists here who practice that. Or when installations became a big thing, well, our artists must make installations. So, but it's always following. It's not, unlike music, and I can't help but contrast it with Jamaican music, where the musicians, they don't care about European tradition or anything. They're just busy creating music that they could dance to and that people there would want to dance to. And in the process, have created such sort of amazing new styles and rhythms of music that have become very influential globally, right? But the art is the opposite, visual art, So I don't know whether that answers your question. Yes, Pat.
Hi, Annie. How you doing?
Hi.
Good. So where would you place an artist like Leah Shaw Johnson's work in? I mean, it seems to me like it's somewhere between, even though Leah Shaw is getting larger in the global marketplace. I'm thinking about his early public art installations on walls and, concrete fixtures in public, and his use of speakers and different things like that.
Right.
How would you situate his work in that conversation?
How does what work?
How would you situate his work in that scholarship?
I mean, so Leigh Shaw and Ebony, I just presented last week there was another presentation on a panel discussing art and music, right? And that is where I place Leigh Shaw, Ebony, all of them. That generation, I think, has been socialized by dancehall, and you can see it in their work. Whereas the earlier generations and not only earlier, even some of the contemporary artists teaching at Edna Manley adopt this very disapproving attitude towards Jamaican popular culture and Jamaican music, and to their detriment, in my opinion, right? And you can see how successful Ebony has been, how Leigh Shaw is on the rise, and Matthew McCarthy is another one. All of them engaging with the music because they are a product of that musical culture themselves, They're not trying to protect themselves from it, as many other artists do.
So you were, and you're in, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very informative for me. You're discussing China's influence in Jamaica, and we see the way China is profiting off so many other countries, largely in Africa. You mentioned the destruction of Allentown, is that right? Allentown?
Construction of?
The destruction of a neighborhood, a historic neighborhood in Jamaica, that they're going to be building and erecting new monuments on. And
Right.
I'm wondering how are artists there sort of responding to that? Because you have the artists who stay in Jamaica who are making such like fringe work that's almost local, like local art, local artists interested. How much are they responding to that global influence today?
I'm not sure how the artists are responding to it, but I can tell you one thing. The one thing I didn't mention here is that the National Gallery of Jamaica's primary benefactor in the last 5 years has been the Chinese government. You know, because the government doesn't have the money to keep, they keep slashing the budget. And the chairman of the board has found the Chinese government very quick to, you know, to hand out money to the gallery. Artists themselves, I find Jamaican artists quite resistant to global influences, by and large. I mean, there are exceptions, of course, but they kind of want to stick to internal and respond to internal prompts and internal debates rather than global ones. And I think this is one reason you don't see their work circulating so much in the, say, the biennales and the Documenta and so on, the big exhibitions.
Yeah, I was going to comment as a person who is pretty
Sorry?
well-traveled in the Caribbean, let's say. I mean, I feel I've been to Cuba a couple of times, and I live in the Virgin Islands, and so I'm going down island. And if you even look at the Virgin Islands, they don't have a lot of artists that are well-known in the marketplace in the U.S., right? Or St. Lucia would be another place that I go to quite often, that there are a lot of really good artists, and there are communities there, and they're talking about issues, and they might be far more global than Jamaica. I haven't been to Jamaica in a while to look at what's going on there. But I find that art, especially as it's expressed in carnivals still, because for me that's performance art, but it's when you're engaged with artists who are trying to use their talent to contribute to the development of their specific islands, right? Cuba, for me, is like the best because there's a commitment to training,
Right.
and it's been there a long time, and the artists really do have a very vibrant community, despite all the economic and political problems that are going on. So for me, my perspective on Jamaica is really based on my parents, right? My mother was one of the first graduates of the University of West Indies, right?
Okay.
And so, and my grandfather was, all his daughters were interested in the arts. They did theater and opera and they moved around, it's true. But Jamaica seems to have produced a lot of strong academics and intellectuals who are concerned about issues that move beyond just economic survival. And most of the people who are having impact are not the artists that I know. You know, people like Basil. You know, Basil lives here in Atlanta, but he's very rooted in Jamaica. And his work is very classical. It's not really dominated by contemporary issues.
You mean Basil Watson?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
So that's what I was wanting to hear something about, because I don't feel like on the ground I know what's going on in Jamaica. I have a stronger sense of, again, the Virgin Islands, St. Lucia, Cuba, St. Kitts,
Right,
Trinidad, right, is very vibrant, strong
Yes, Trinidad has outstripped Jamaica, yeah. Trinidad, part of the problem is Jamaica has no commercial galleries left. We don't. So there's nowhere to show work. It's a very, very dysfunctional art ecosystem. There's some crucial aspects that are missing, and artists are basically left on their own, and they're not getting very good training either. There's only one institution, one training institution, which has been diminished over the years. Same problem, diminishing budget. They also relied a lot on a handful of lecturers who were there for 30, 35 years, and as they die, how do you replace them? How do you renew these institutions? How do you renew the National Gallery? These are big questions, and so I can't really, I don't want to repeat what I've said in the last 3 evenings. So
Thank you for sharing. I
yeah.
appreciate you.
Okay.
So I was, on our first week, Monique talked about or focused on the Rastafari artists. So when I saw Ready Freddy and with the Rasta and dreadlocks,
Yes.
exactly as you came to later, I was just really kind of taken aback about that mixture of image. But you said that it was the dread boys on the beach kind of maybe emulating going on. Do you think there was any more subversive project that kind of maybe people adopted this image of Ready Freddy and the Rasta? Because if that's so counter to the Rasta culture, and again, thinking about a little what Monique talked about, this political kind of trying to destroy the Rasta and Rasta image. Right. Was there anything more? And then secondly, the theorist or that you mentioned, I think his name was Robinson, and this kind of use of
Gordon Robinson,
the
yeah.
erection that seems to now continue through the use of between the image of Edna Manley and the Ready Freddy, but the use of the mortal erection and talking about this as China comes in, or the correlation. Is there anything deeper? Does it stay just on the surface?
I don't think so. I mean, when he was talking about buildings as erections, that really had nothing to do with Negro aroused or Ready Freddy. It's just that's me pulling all of this together, right? Because it, obviously
Language,
it fits,
not literal,
yeah,
but language. So.
right. So he's one of these columnists who's considered very humorous and is always taking digs at situations, current situations. He's a lawyer by training, and but the Chinese situation, you're not hearing about it very much right now, but there are periods when something happens and everyone then gets very upset about whatever it is. Maybe a Chinese person hit somebody, another laborer who's Black Jamaican, whatever. It's kind of a potentially volatile situation. I personally have not seen it trickle down into the artwork, as such. Not yet, anyway. Yeah. Yep. We done? Good. Good.